Today is our fourth sermon in our ongoing series of sermons about God's big story, and it's entitled Ongoing Problems, Sin, and it's from taken from 2 Samuel 11. When that time of year came around again, the anniversary of the Ammonite aggression, David dispatched Joab and his fighting men of Israel in full force to destroy the Ammonites for good. They laid siege to Rabbah, but David stayed in Jerusalem. One late afternoon, David got up from taking his nap and was strolling on the roof of the palace. From his vantage point on the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was stunningly beautiful. David sent to ask about her and was told, "Isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent his agents to get her. After she arrived, he went to bed with her. This occurred during the time of purification following her period. Then she returned home. Before long, she realised she was pregnant. Later, she sent word to David, "I'm pregnant." David then got in touch with Joab. "Send Uriah the Hittite to me." Joab sent him. When he arrived, David asked him for news from the front, how things were going with Joab and the troops with the fighting. Then he said to Uriah, "Go home, have a refreshing bath and a good night's rest." After Uriah left the palace, an informant of the king was sent after him. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance along with the king's servants. David was told that Uriah had not gone home. He asked Uriah, "Didn't you just come off a hard trip, so why didn't you go home?" Uriah replied to David, "The chest is out there with the fighting men of Israel and Judah in tents. My master Joab and his servants are roughing it out in the fields. So how can I go home and eat and drink and enjoy my wife? On your life, I'll not do it." "All right," said David, "have it your way. Stay for the day and I'll send you back tomorrow." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem the rest of the day. The next day, David invited him to eat and drink with him, and David got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah again went out and slept with his master's servants. He didn't go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In the letter, he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is the fiercest, then pull back and leave him exposed so that he's sure to be killed." So Joab, holding the city under siege, put Uriah in a place where he knew there were fierce enemy fighters. When the city's defenders came out to fight Joab, some of David's soldiers were killed, including Uriah the Hittite. Joab sent David a full report on the battle. He instructed the messenger, "After you have given to the king a detailed report on the battle, if he flares in anger, say, 'And by the way, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead.'" Joab's messenger arrived in Jerusalem and gave the king a full report. He said, "The enemy was too much for us. They advanced on us in the open field and we pushed them back to the city gate. But then arrows came hot and heavy on us from the city wall, and 18 of the king's soldiers died." When the messenger completed his report of the battle, David got angry at Joab. He vented it on the messenger. "Why did you get so close to the city? Didn't you know you'd be attacked from the wall? Didn't you remember how Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth, got killed? Wasn't it a woman who dropped a millstone on him from the wall and crushed him at Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall?" "By the way," said Joab's messenger, "your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." Then David told the messenger, "Oh, I see. Tell Joab, don't trouble yourself over this. War kills. Sometimes one, sometimes another. You never know who's next. Redouble your assault on the city and destroy it. Encourage Joab." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she grieved for her husband. When the time of mourning was over, David sent someone to bring her to his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. How on earth did that happen? Have you ever seen something that's left you thinking that if you go down York Village and you look on the left, you'll see that Bob the farmer, who has the Iron Man, has got a cow on his roof. Not a real one, it's the bench that used to be at Mytton Fold. But nevertheless, you go past and you think, how on earth did that happen? Quite frankly, when we hear this story of David and Bathsheba, that leaves us thinking, how on earth did this happen? It's utterly embarrassing. It's not the sort of thing we expect to deal with on a Sunday morning or in polite company. It's hard to imagine that this is the same David that we thought we knew so well. The David who courageously killed the giant Goliath, the man who wrote the book of Psalms. David was a man to be trusted, who obeyed and worshipped the Lord. He saw God accomplish great things through him. He expressed his love for God in beautiful songs of praise. And we often find David seeking and submitting to God's direction in his life. So it's a shock to see everything go so horribly, horribly wrong. It was spring, a time when kings normally led their militaries into battle to secure and expand the boundaries of their kingdoms. David had sent his armies out, but he had remained home at the palace. One evening, he couldn't sleep, so he went for a walk on the palace roof to get some fresh air. And while he was there, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. Instead of doing the right thing, which would be to look away, he called one of his servants to find out who she was, and discovered it was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, who was one of David's bodyguards. But despite her being the wife of one of his soldiers, this didn't stop David from acting on his lust. He sends his servant to get Bathsheba and bring her back to the palace. He sleeps with her and sends her home in the morning. I wonder if David actually felt any guilt, or just put it down to being a perk of being the king. It's hard to know. But that single night landed him in massive trouble when Bathsheba told the king that she was pregnant. Now what? How was he going to explain this to Bathsheba's husband, Uriah? So David quickly formulated a plan. If David could just get Uriah home, hopefully he would sleep with Bathsheba and everyone would think that the baby was with his. But Uriah comes back and doesn't go home. To David's frustration, Uriah explains it just wouldn't be right for him to sleep at home while his fellow soldiers were away from their families and fighting. So he resorted to plan B, to get Uriah drunk. Then maybe he'd lower his inhibitions, stagger home and sleep with his wife. But the next morning, where does David find Uriah? Sleeping at the palace. So David sends Uriah back to battle with a message for Joab, the military commander of his army. The message was simple and to the point. Put Uriah on the front lines and then retreat, leaving him to die. This phase went exactly as David had hoped. David and Bathsheba received the news that Uriah had been killed in battle. In fact, this part of the plan almost went better than David could have hoped. Not only was he spared the embarrassment of people discovering his affair with Bathsheba, but he also looked really good in the eyes of the people who heard what he did next. He took the pregnant widow Bathsheba into his home and married her. How did this happen to the man that the Bible describes as a man after the Lord's own heart? David, in the space of 15 verses, breaks at least 3 of the 10 commandments in a cold and calculated fashion. You shall not covet your neighbour's wife. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. David's lust turned into adultery, which turned into deceit, which turned into murder. He spiralled steadily downwards until he finally hit rock bottom. This incident starts a tragic path for the family of David. Sinful pride convinced the king that he knew better than God and he could ignore what God called him to do and be. David didn't take his sin seriously. And finally, David tried to cover up his sin instead of confessing it and receiving God's forgiveness. David is a famous king with a tragic flaw. His story is told with great frankness. It's a warning for us. There are no excuses given. Surely this story is told so that we might see the same kind of tendencies in ourselves and learn from David's mistake. The Bible is full of stories that reveal the effect of following or rejecting God. They show the reality of the daily struggle to lead a good life. David and Bathsheba, of all people you'd expect to stick with God, it would be his special representative, the king. Especially as David has experienced the faithfulness of God over many years, personally in his struggles with his enemies and as a leader of God's chosen people. So this story just goes to show that everyone is vulnerable to temptation and that sin can distort and destroy. Amen.